You know, when Bobi Wine landed in Washington, D.C. this week, most people saw an activist fighting for freedom, and rightly so, because chances are, obviously, he's been persecuted. He's probably the most sought after politician in Uganda politics. But what if I told you that his presence is part of a much larger strategy, a strategy where America doesn't invade countries anymore, it recruits their opposition leaders instead. So today we're breaking down AGOA. Now, a lot of people, when they hear the term AGOA, which is AGOA, that means the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a lot of people associate this with either tips, money, or some people think it's a non-government organization that has got free money to give, okay? But what if I tell you that AGOA has become the most sophisticated tool for controlling African sovereignty, not through military force, but through trade and through leverage, and through the very people that are fighting against their own governments, like Mr. Bobi Wine. So without wasting time, let's dive into how the West maintains control over Africa in 2026 and how a growing number of African countries are cleverly avoiding this trap. And also we're going to look at the implications of people like Bobi Wine and what that means for the African continent, particularly for his own country, Uganda, because yes, he's there, he's seeking help from the international community, but obviously this will have greater consequences and it carries greater risks, not just now, but for many years to come for his own country as well as for the entire African continent. So let's start with the basics here. Now, you all agree with me that AGOA always sounds good on paper. You know, anything that helps people out, dishes out medication, it's helping the farmers' input, and it's improving people's economies. That is something that is always good and is something that is supported. But unfortunately, at the same time, it's being used as something unprecedented as part of the Americans' foreign policy, and I will explain why. So AGOA was created in the year 2000 as a trade preference program, which sounds great. You know, it's a great idea, you know, give African countries some kind of preferential access to American markets, you know, give them lower tariffs, you know, better terms. It sounds like a gift, you know, it sounds like just what every African country should actually do, you know, join AGOA. But it's only when some of these countries join AGOA, they realize, oops, we shouldn't have joined AGOA because of the implications that obviously come with it. So here's the catch. AGOA comes with conditions, okay? It comes with eligibility requirements, and those requirements, they are designed to be impossible to meet consistently, okay? Because countries have to maintain what they call as the rule of law. They have to maintain democratic governance, respect for human rights, respect for international law, all these vague standards, all these vague terms, subjective standards, because, I mean, the reason why I call them subjective, because the very same people that are supposed to lead by example are clearly not. I mean, we don't have to go far. We just have to go to Venezuela, recently Greenland, and just a few weeks ago, we saw what happened in Iran. That was a total breach of international law. So these are standards that America can weaponize whenever it wants and use it for their own benefit. Now, in 2024, 39 countries qualified for AGOA benefits. And by 2026, that number is going down and down. That number is now shrinking. Guinea lost eligibility after the military coup. We saw what happened in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso followed as well after that military coup. Mali got suspended first and then later kicked out. And now Uganda. Now, if you think of Uganda, Uganda is now walking on a tightrope because of what Bobi Wine is actually doing to his own country. And the reason why somebody like Museveni should be worried about AGOA is because AGOA isn't just about trade. It's about political control. And when a country doesn't bend to American pressure, America uses AGOA as a whip. And this is what is probably keeping Museveni, you know, to have sleepless nights about it, because he knows the implications, he knows the importance of this AGOA, particularly just after elections. This is the time for him to prove that he can do something good for his own country, and to think that the AGOA tap is going to be closed This is something that is unprecedented for his country because we're talking of big monies, which we shall dwell in the course of this video. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Like I said, America doesn't need to invade anymore. Okay, it doesn't need to stage coups. It just needs to find the right opposition leader. Think about it. Bobi Wine arrives in Washington. He meets congressional staff. He demands sanctions against Museveni. He calls for investigations into US aid misuse. And suddenly Uganda's AGOA status becomes uncertain. Now, one thing to understand here is that Bobi Wine isn't doing this alone. Okay, this man is being amplified. It would be so silly to think that all of these things that Bobi Wine is doing is as a result of his own accord. He's chosen to go to Washington because he wants to lobby against the Ugandan government. No, I don't think that's the case. You see, he's being supported, and whether he knows it or not, he's become a tool in the America's larger strategy to reshape Uganda's government. And people like Museveni knows all about this, and that's the reason why we've not heard much from the Mr. Museveni himself. He's not commented on any of this, because this is a very sensitive matter, to the point that once that AGOA tap gets closed, then we'll be looking at some issues, economic issues that will affect Uganda unprecedentedly. So this is a big deal. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is a big deal in Uganda currently, let's just work with the numbers here. Okay, so Uganda exports over 800 million annually under AGOA benefits. Okay, so we're looking at so many things here. So we're looking at textiles, we are looking at things like agricultural products, minerals, you name it. Most of these things are going under AGOA benefits with reduced tariffs and so on. Now, remove AGOA out of the picture, you're looking at an economy that instantly fractures. There will be unemployment spikes, and then pressure on Museveni actually intensifies. And suddenly, the opposition leader America's backing becomes the solution. And this is how the manipulation actually works. So you close the tap on the person you don't like, and then open the AGOA tap on somebody that you feel is the right person to lead the country. So one thing to realize is that this is how puppets of the West are manufactured. This is a pattern that happens all across the continent. So if we look at Guinea, for instance, Guinea had a military coup in 2021. The junta takes over. America doesn't like it. What happens? AGOA eligibility is suspended, economic pressure mounts, and the message is very clear. They send a very clear message. You fall in line or you face the consequences. You starve, basically. They just close that tap, and then that is it. You start seeing different things. Burkina Faso, the same similar story. Military government, AGOA suspended, but Traore now sees an opportunity, to turn things around without Western influence, and it seems to be working, because what this young man has done, I think he's 36, 37 years old, he's really pushed things up to the point that he's not needed any Western influence, well, apart from Russia and China, but he's really done well. He's turned around the economy. He's in the middle of war, but at the time developing the country in ways that he's becoming an envy, not just to the African leaders, but to most of the leaders worldwide, and to the people like us, normal people that are looking at him and are saying, well, he's done really well. Again, when you go to Tanzania, President Samia Suluhu is also walking in a very careful line. She's trying to maintain AGOA eligibility whilst also pushing back on some of the American demands. You remember recently there was that volatile election that happened. They must really be worried about the fact that they were going to lose their AGOA funding, and the tap was going to get closed, and that was going to mean economic collapse. They have to prove themselves to the AGOA tap that everything is okay. The pressure is obviously constant, but every trade negotiation that they do, every tariff discussion, the eligibility review, they've got to make sure that everything is fine. And it's a reminder, basically, that you cooperate, make sure that you cooperate, or you lose everything. And this is what most Africa countries have to go through. We talk about independence, we talk about being sovereign, and yet most of our sovereignty is actually based, especially when it comes to economic matters, most of it is actually based on or supported by the Western influence. So you cannot really be independent without being financially free. So I think that's a very big problem that a lot of African countries are currently facing. And the irony of all of this is America doesn't have to explicitly say, we are supporting this opposition leader to overthrow your government. They simply suspend AGOA, close it up, apply the tariffs. We saw what happened in South Africa. They slapped South Africa at the time with 30% tariffs in the hope of punishing South Africa because of the diplomatic relations at the time following the G20 meeting and the accusations that there was the white genocide that was happening in South Africa. And that was unprecedented because overnight, within a few hours, within a day or so, the entire auto industry was just there. And as we know, South Africa produces the C-Class sedan in a place called, what's that place again called? It's a place called, I think it's Eastern London or something in South Africa. Now, when I talk about Eastern London, it's a place in South Africa and not in the United Kingdom. So they produce the C-Class sedans that were being shipped to the United States of America. But because of that 30% tariff, it became almost impossible to ship those Mercedes-Benzes to the United States of America. And luckily, China, as they always do, they've always find an opportunity. The Chinese people intervened, and now all these Mercedes-Benzes, the C-Class sedans, are being shipped to China. So you can see how this AGOA tap is really effective. You know, one simple move, they close the tap on you, and then that is it. So obviously the whole idea of having that AGOA tap is to basically run the show, you know, try and enforce policy on you. And so when they want any opposition leader to challenge the incumbent government, all they simply do is to amplify that opposition leader, fund them, and legitimize them. I mean, if you look at what happened with Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, that was unprecedented. I mean, up to now, a lot of people don't even have answers as to what actually happened. So in the case of the opposition leader here, obviously, we've got Bobi Wine. He thinks he's fighting for freedom. And we've got the American government that think it's advancing democracy in that particular region. And then the Africans, obviously the African nation like Uganda, is currently caught up in the middle of, it's forced to choose between economic survival and political sovereignty. And probably that's the reason why the museveni is not probably commenting much about it, because whatever he says, obviously this will determine whether that tap gets closed or it remains open. And like we said, you know, closing that tap at this time, particularly just after elections, will cause a lot of suffering for a lot of people. So I only hope that Bobi Wine realizes as well that, you know, if that AGOA tap is actually closed at the moment, there'll be lots of issues. You know, the implications are great because this will actually affect even Bobi Wine's own supporters. It will affect meaningful citizens of Uganda might get affected once that AGOA tap is actually shut down. So this is such a big deal, and we can only hope that he really understands what is currently happening. If you look at President Museveni himself, he must really be feeling sorry for Bobi Wine, because in his time when he went into exile, he took 29 men with him and went into the bush to fight that guerrilla war and to win the grassroots fights with the people. You know, he never went to Washington, or he never sought any help from the West. In fact, the West actually hated the man. They didn't like him at all. I know hate is a very strong term, but they never really liked the man. The man was despised at all levels. And here we are. We've got a man, we've got Mr. Bobi Wine with his suit, plane ticket, tie, flying all the way to Capitol Hill to lobby for sanctions against such a man. So this is something that a lot of people will put one and one together and say, well, you know, if you are going to fight this fight, you know, you're going to ask for help right from the very people that will turn around and say, well, we helped you do this and that, so can you do this, this, and that? So at that point, it will become almost impossible to say, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do this because of ABCD. I mean, the rhetoric that we've seen lately is that things are changing. You know, there's a continental pattern that things are changing within Africa. I mean, a lot of African leaders are starting to see the pattern, you know. And just recently, I don't know whether you heard about this, but the president of Zambia, Mr. Hakainde Hichilema, also known as HH, rejected over 1 billion from the United States meant to fight HIV, malaria, and all these diseases because the funds had strings attached. Now, what were the strings attached? It had a clause requiring a bilateral compact to give the United States preferential treatment or preferential access to copper, to cobalt, lithium, the same stuff that people use in mobile phones or electric vehicles. And obviously, when the Zambian president said, you know what, we are not doing that, guess what? The United States turned around and say, well, in that case, we are actually stopping your medicine supply, So this is unprecedented. You can see that the United States is not joking anymore. It's a tit for tat kind of thing, and it's all in the open, obviously, because of Donald Trump's approach. He's a businessman. That if you do not do this for us, then obviously we won't do the same for you. So, without shame, they're just doing some of these things, and it's unprecedented. If you look at how China is dealing with things, in contrast with China offers large-scale trade. It offers what they call as infrastructure funding with zero tariff access to many African countries without openly linking deals to internal political systems. So there's a very big difference. And then also when it comes to the funding, the difference in scale is huge. AGOA trade was only about $8 billion in 2024. Now compare that with China. With the Chinese-African trade was about $295 billion, which is about 3 times more than the AGOA tap. So in view of all of these things that we've just talked about, the question isn't whether Bobi Wine will succeed in Uganda. The real question is, can African nations build economic independence with each other without AGOA in the picture, without relying on that tap, whether it will be open or closed, for your own needs? This is something that a lot of African countries need to think about. So where does this leave us? So we've got Bobi Wine is in Washington. He's fighting for Uganda's freedom. And maybe he genuinely believes that he's fighting for freedom. But like I said, he's also part of a larger game where opposition leaders become tools. And the sooner he realizes that, the better for him. Now, the question for Africa isn't whether to support or reject Bobi Wine. The question is, how do we build an Africa that doesn't need AGOA? This tap that they can easily open and close at will, that is not the kind of life that African leaders need to live. And Africa with its own trade networks is a more positive Africa. You can imagine having your own economic power, your own ability to say no to foreign pressure, and whether that pressure comes from America, China, or anyone else. I think this is what African leaders need. Lately we've seen President Hakainde Hichilema, the president of the Republic of Zambia, really stepping up in his game and speaking out against Western influence at many different levels. And that is something that is encouraging to watch. And that's the real fight. That's the real continental uprising we should be watching. This is very, very impressive. Because when we talk about we are reclaiming, this is not just about past revolutions. It's about the economic independence that Africa needs to claim right now. If you think this kind of deep dive is worth your time, do me a favor and hit subscribe. And also turn on that notification bell so you can get notified every time a video is uploaded. It actually helps more than you think to keep this channel independent. So thanks for hanging out and watching the whole thing. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.